Good morning and welcome to Bible study at Calvary Baptist Church. I'm here with five of my favorite friends, and we've just been discussing a little bit of things here and there, and we do have a baby in our midst. She's one of my friends too, and so if Baylor coos or says anything or does whatever, I think she finally dozed off and maybe went to sleep. But if she does something, don't think anything about it. We love babies. It's all right. Okay. So we're still continuing with the theme that we've been going through for the last 3 weeks through the month of June, and that is promises we can count on. And I love this because we went back to the beginning, that is Genesis, and we began to look at covenants that God had made with people, with his creation and what those things meant. So we looked at how God had created Adam and Eve in the beginning. He made man in his image, and he promised fruitfulness to them through a covenant that he made with them. We looked at Noah, and after the flood, Noah, God made a promise of preservation with him. And then last week we looked at Abram and in Genesis 12, and God had, initiated a covenant with him. And so today then we look at Moses, and it's not just Moses, it's the people. When God delivered them out of the bondage that they were in Egypt, the Exodus we call it, and they left Egypt, and God took them to the wilderness to really train them, to teach them, to help them figure out who they were and who he wanted them to be. Then God really had to get them to the place where they could be not just a patriarch who learned from God, but a people, a nation. And so he called them out. And I don't know if you really have thought about this, or if it's been a while since you studied it, or you went through all this, but in world affairs, even today, the nation of Israel is pivotal in what goes on in the world. And we're seeing that, we're living through that. And we should know it. We should understand it because it is biblical. It is biblical truth, and we need to pay attention to it. We need to remember it. And so that's why this is so good for us to go back and look at promises we can count on, because God has made promises to his creation. He's made promises to his people through the years, and he has promised to make them a holy nation. They came out of Egypt. They were in bondage. They had been there so many centuries, so many years, they didn't even know how to live on their own. And so we get out of there, or they get out of there, and then we begin to see how God has to kind of teach them, has to train them. It reminds me of our friends, our missionary friends, Matt and Chris Long, and they've been in Papua New Guinea with their little boys. And first time they came back, the boys didn't even know how to be in America, because Ty had been here some as a child, but Wick was born here, and then they left, went right to the mission field. And so he had been a baby, had been there all the time. They had to teach him how to cross streets. They had to teach him how to do things, because there's not that kind of activity and things in Papua New Guinea where they were. And so they just had to teach them how to be Americans. Well, they're back now again. And they've been back over there a few years, and the boys are older, but I'm sure, had to reprogram them, had to reteach them about this isn't how we live. And so that's what God had to do. He took them out into the wilderness to initially help them understand who they were and the kind of people that he wanted them to be. And God had to train them to not just follow the rules that someone had put over them, that like Egypt or some other peoples had forced upon them. They really needed to learn how to be obedient to a holy God. And so, I think about one of the things in this lesson, God had to teach them not just to be good for goodness sake. That's what Santa Claus wants you to do, be good for goodness sake. But God had to teach them how to be obedient. He had to, he expects that of us as his people. And so God had to teach them how to be obedient, not just because it's required and not just because it's what we ought to do, but we would be obedient for the sake of God. And we would be obedient for all that he's done for us. We would be obedient because of who he is in our lives, and that we would be accountable and faithful to him. So with that in mind, let's just dive in and see how far we get. Okay. Exodus 19, then, is where we'll begin in verses 1 through 4. In the third month, from the very day the Israelites left the land of Egypt, they came to the Sinai wilderness. So it took them 3 months to get there. Now, remember, there's a lot of people came out of Egypt. There was, some have estimated, there's about 1 million men. Some have estimated with women and children could have been 3.5 million people. And that's a lot of people to just drag across the desert. You don't just load them on a boxcar and take them. Uh, it, they had to move, and I'm sure they moved slow. So they came out of there and they went to the Sinai wilderness. Now, remember, Sinai wilderness is kind of an area, but the mountain, uh, Horeb and Sinai are the same thing. So when you read in the scripture, some will say Horeb, or sometimes it will say Horeb, sometimes it'll say Sinai or Sinai, however you want to pronounce it, or however it is that you've been taught it. And so he says they came to the Sinai wilderness, and there they were. Can you imagine at the base of a mountain or in the mountain somewhere? It's a wilderness. The only place, or the only thing that it was good for was, maybe grazing some sheep every once in a while when there was vegetation growing. That's where Moses was grazing sheep, remember, when God set the bush afire and invited Moses to come to him, and then called out Moses to go and deliver his people and bring them back to this mountain. Now, that was Moses, the mission that he had. That was what he was to do, was to go, and he was to be the one that God would use as his instrument, as the deliverer of the people out of Egypt. And so Moses went, he obeyed, went and did it, and then God called him back. And then, you look at this and you kind of say, well, Moses could have said, okay, here, God, my mission is complete. I'm here. But the mission was just starting, wasn't it? Because God had a whole lot more that Moses needed to do as the leader, as the one who had brought them out. So the mission was not complete at this point. Matter of fact, we know we're almost 4,000 years later, and we know the mission is still going on, isn't it? The mission is still there. So it says in the third month, from the very day Israelites left the land of Egypt, and they came to the Sinai wilderness. They traveled from Rephidim, came to the Sinai wilderness, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. And exactly which mountain is it? Well, we've kind of lost that through years. You can kind of look and say, was it that one? Was it that one? Well, that would have been a good one. Well, that, and it's just, there's lots of mountains in there. It's just lots of mountains through there. And so you have to kind of say, God knew where it was. Moses knew where it was. And do we have to know? No, we just know it's in that area. And so it says Moses, verse 3, Moses went up the mountain to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. This is what you must say to the house of Jacob. Remember, Jacob was patriarch, and explain to the Israelites. You must explain this to them. Jacob, God changed his name to Israel after he had wrestled with the angel of God. And so God changed his name to Israel. And so, therefore, the people, his descendants, were called the Israelites. And so he says to them, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians. And then some translations, put that verb with it in every one of these clauses. And you have seen how I carried you on eagle's wings, and you have seen how I brought you to myself. Now, the translation we're using doesn't use all those, but I wanted you to hear that, because there's 3 you have seens in this, 3 things that are significant. And God is saying to them, look, I brought you here not only because I'm trying to teach you and trying to train you and trying to make you and mold you into a nation, into a people who are able to stand independently obedient to me, but I'm trying to help you understand what your purpose is, what your calling is, trying to get you organized. If you look back at, I think it's chapter 18 in Exodus, that's where Moses was trying to judge the people and trying to sort out all the problems. And his father-in-law said to him, hey, you got to get a handle on this. Jethro, his father-in-law, came to visit and said, you got to get a handle on this. If you don't, you're out of control. And who else to do it but Moses? Because guess what? Oh, he'd lived in Pharaoh's court for all these years. He knew how to organize stuff. He just wasn't doing it. And so he did it, and was able to then get the people organized. And that was one big step in them becoming a nation. So I love these things that God reminded them of. He said, "You've seen what I did to the Egyptians." Well, they went through the plagues because Pharaoh hardened his heart and he wouldn't let the people go. They went through finally. Then, when there was deliverance, they went to the Red Sea, and God opened up the sea, and they crossed over. And when they got to the other side, the waters then receded or came back on to Pharaoh's army and drowned them. We saw how that happened, and so God is saying to them, "You saw what I did with the Egyptians." And then he says, "You saw how I carried you on eagle's wings." When they first started out, what did God say? He said, "I'm going to lead you with a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day, and you will follow me wherever those go, you'll go with me." And so for 3 months, they've been following, they've been going, they've been doing that. And then the most important part of all this is God says, "I brought you to myself. I brought you to myself." What's important isn't all the miraculous things that we see God do in our lives. What is important, and all those things they matter. It matters that, gosh, you go on a trip somewhere, you ask God for safety, and then when you get home, you didn't have an accident, you were safe, or something bad happens to you, and you say, "God, help me through this," and God does. Those things matter. But what really matters is the fact that all the time, God wants to be in relationship with you. He doesn't just want to be your Santa Claus. He doesn't just want you to be good for goodness sake. He wants you to be in a right relationship with him through his son, Jesus Christ, in order, just like the Israelites, he can bring you to himself in order that you can become made in the image of his son, Jesus Christ. That's the whole purpose of it. That's the whole point of it. I think about, Moses having led some mission trips and having been on mission trips and things. Moses was on a mission trip here, and people don't always obey on mission trips. I don't want to hear anything, Aaron. I don't want to hear anything about that. I know you were always a good girl on a mission trip, but I know, Dylan, you were always a good guy on a mission trip. But sometimes you have trouble. Sometimes you have to fight some things on a mission trip. And it's not always just the people. People have weird ideas and they don't always go along and don't cooperate. Sometimes you have to fight ideology. Sometimes you have to fight Satan himself on mission trips. That's the hard part. That's the thing where you just have to let God do it. And that's where Moses was. He's on a mission trip with a couple million people probably or more. And here he is out in the wilderness. And so, well, they've reached this destination. It's a location, but there's a greater destination where God wants to get them. And that is, he's brought them to himself. Okay? Then we read the next passage. And just out of that, we're to remember what God has done for us. Man, he's done a lot, hasn't he? We can't even begin to say thanks for all the things that God has done for us. Then we jump to Exodus 19. Well, no, that's where we were. We jump to the next verses, then 5-6. And it says, God said to Moses, "Now if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant." This is part of the message he's supposed to say to the people, right? This is what, as the messenger, Moses is supposed to communicate to them. He says, "If you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine. And you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites." So God has given Moses this instructions. Remember, verses before he said, remember those three things. Remember what we did to the Egyptians. Remember how I brought you out on eagle's wings. And remember that I brought you to myself. That here we are at God's mountain, so to speak, even though all mountains are his. But here is the place where Moses knew where he was, where God had met him, and he brought him there to do that. Those are conditional statements, folks. When he says, remember the purpose for which God set apart a people unto himself. Remember what your purpose is. And conditionally, he says, if you will carefully listen, that's a condition. You got to pay attention to what God is saying. And then he says, if you'll keep my covenant, and that is, be my people, be faithful, be loyal, set yourselves apart, be holy, be set apart. And then God says, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine. God really has it all. Those are conditional statements. And, I think about for Moses to get back to a place where he had met God was meaningful to him. Yeah, it had to be fulfilling. And not only to have completed the mission, so to speak, and done what God asked him to do, but to get to that place where he could get the next orders and the next thing. And that's kind of like a mission trip too. You like, I always like to go and scout it out if I was leading or if I was going to be a part of a leadership of a mission trip. Go and scout it out, look it over, see what we were up against, know where we were, and then go get those who were going to be part of the team, bring them there. And then once you get them there, now the instructions are, here's what we do. Here's how we make a difference. Here's how we do kingdom work. And sometimes it was teaching Bible school. Sometimes it was doing some street witnessing. Sometimes it was encouraging a church. There's a lot of things that we did in those kinds of things. But Moses is on this big mission trip, isn't he? He's gone to Midian. He met God. He scoped it out. He scouted it out. He went back, got the people, and brought them to that place. And so God has a purpose. He has set them apart to be his people. And he said, you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. Notice God didn't say to them, you're going to rule the world. No, that's not what he's doing. That's not who he's calling them to be. They're not going to be the rulers. Matter of fact, they're going to be best if they figure out that it all belongs to God. He's got it under control. And, people who are trying to make Israel be something they're not, even in our day, they don't get it. They really don't get it. Israel is not there to be the rulers in the area. That's not what they want. They're not the ones who initiate the takeovers. They're not the ones who initiate the wars. They just want to be able to live in the place that God has given them. Even then, way back when they crossed the they crossed the Jordan into Jericho, they just want to be the people who live in God's land and be obedient to him, to be, as God said, my kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And when they are at their best, that's who they are. That's who they're meant to be. They don't necessarily want all the turmoil and all the problems that are going on. So those images, kingdom of priests, a holy nation. In 1 Peter 2:9, Peter uses that same terminology in the Christian realm. And he talks about how, as believers in Jesus Christ, we are that same people. Well, that's because people like Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, but also in the book of Acts, talked about God's purpose being that, there is a new Israel, that Israel isn't necessarily that old nation, even though it still is. But there's a new Israel, and that is those who put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ. So if you are a confessing, born-again, believing Christian, and if you say, I've committed my life to Jesus Christ, I've been baptized into his kingdom, into his church, and I'm going to be obedient to him, you're basically saying, I'm new Israel. And I'm going to be this kingdom of priests. I'm going to be this holy priesthood, this holy nation that is his messenger to the world, to tell the world Jesus saves. And so it's interesting, isn't it, how those kinds of themes, they don't die. The scripture is consistent with those through and through. So then we get to the last section, which is Exodus 19, verses 7 through 8. And it says, after Moses came back, he summoned the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. So God said to him, okay, go up, or he went up on the mountain. He met God. God said, do this. This is what you're supposed to do. Then he went down from the mountain and he summoned all the elders together. Why? It's because in chapter 18, he's already got things organized. He's already got things put in place to where now God can communicate to the people. Can you imagine Moses kind of standing at the foot of the mountain and without a microphone, without a loudspeaker system, trying to communicate this stuff to all the people? No. So he summoned all the elders of all these groups together and said, you tell your group, you tell your group, you tell your group, and let them know this is what God says we are to do. And they came back, they reported it to Moses. And then Moses said, I'm going back up the mountain to tell God. Now, did he really need to make that trip? Don't you think God already knew? Don't you think God knew exactly what they said? Of course he did. He's God. But Moses needed to go back up the mountain to be faithful and to be obedient and to say to God, I did my part. I did what I was supposed to do. You know, folks, that's the way with us. When God tells us to do something, when we do it, we need to follow through all the way. We don't need to just kind of leave it hanging or do part of it. You know, when we say, I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back, no turning back. When we sing that, it means we need to follow through all the way. We need to go all the way with him. Now then, though none go with me, still I will follow. And that's what Moses was doing. I think they've said it's hard to keep track of how many times from this point on that Moses went up and down to the mountain. You know, we could call him Mountain Climber Moses, maybe. But no less than 4 times did he go up the mountain and talk to God and then come back down. I can't even imagine how long that would take. I'm not a good mountain climber. I'm not well versed in that kind of thing. But Moses knew the way, and he went, and he did it, and he met God. No less than 4 times. It might have even been more when you break it down. So anyway, so Moses came back. He summoned the elders of the people, set before them all these words the Lord had commanded him, and then all the people responded together, we will do all that the Lord has spoken. So Moses brought the words back to the Lord. The people agreed. Think about that in just a moment. They've been out of Egypt 3 months to the day, folks. How long did it take Moses to go up there? We don't know. How long did it take him to get back down? We don't know. How long did it take God to communicate to him? We don't know. But it says they got there 3 months to the day after they left Egypt. So all this is fresh on their mind. They're remembering we went through years of slavery and bondage in Egypt. Now here we are out here. And then not only did we have to do that, but now God's taking us to a wilderness place, to a place where things are pretty desolate. And here we are. But God needs to remind them that if they will enter into covenant with him, if they'll do what he says, he will be their God and they will be his people. And the people agreed. And so Moses took the people's word back to the Lord. It was an act of accountability that not only was Moses accountable, but the people were accountable. He was their spokesperson. And okay, I know you've read the Old Testament, you know, did they keep their end of the bargain? Did they keep the covenant? No, man never can. Man is sinful and finite. God is holy and God is sovereign and infinite. You know, there's a difference, isn't there? There is. But God was able to do his part, and that's what matters. We need to do the best we can to do our part. So don't be good for goodness sake. Be good because you are in a loving covenant relationship with a loving covenant God who wants the best for you. Okay? How'd we do? Hey, man, we did all right today. Well, God bless y'all. And think on those things. Remember, God, if you are being convicted by his presence and by his spirit, remember, he wants you. He wants you to want him. That's what matters. God bless y'all. Bye-bye.